pleasure, Nur, to, I think, meet you for the first time, perhaps.
Yes.
And certainly have a chance to get to know you a little bit. Your name is a legend, of course, in Cambridge, and many of our students have read your books. But I wondered whether we could just start with perhaps your family background. And,
yes.
Father, ancestors,
Yes.
and
Yes.
something about that.
Yes. Yes. Well, I come from a very intellectual family. My grandfather was a writer in Salonika. He edited a newspaper in Salonika called Gonje Edep. And one of my uncles, Ahmet Emin Yalman, was a very famous journalist, working in the 1900s, 1910, from 1910 until 1975 or so, 50, 60 years, fighting for freedom of the press, liberty, free democratic institutions in Turkey. I was born in Istanbul and into this family with this tradition of, very strong tradition of commitment to political liberty, beginning with the Ottoman Empire, but then going on to the Turkish Republic. And when I was born, it was a time when the Cultural Revolution in Turkey was still very fresh. I recall my grandmother trying to learn the new Latin alphabet, trying to switch over from the old Ottoman script to the new alphabet, but making headway and making sure that she could read the newspapers every day. And my dear uncle used to write literally rivers of editorials every day, which were then read by my aunt to my grandfather every morning, and I would often sit on his lap and listen to this. So I come from that sort of background. And I went to a very good American school in Istanbul called Robert College. Very, still going on and still a very impressive school. I'm now one of the trustees of that school. At that school there were a number of wonderful Englishmen. One was Philip Alliot, who had been a fellow of Peterhouse, and he took a liking to me. He was a wonderful man, an extremely gifted teacher of biology. He had been a fellow of Peterhouse and he'd given up his fellowship and had come to teach at that school. I don't know quite what motivated him to do that, but there were some others. There was Hilary Sumner Boyd from Christ Church, Oxford, who was half American, but also highly gifted and intellectual. And these two people had a very profound effect on me as I was growing up. And it was Philip Alliot's recommendation through his...
How do you spell his name?
Alliot.
A-L-I-O-T.
No, U-L-L-Y-O-T, or U-L, I think it was double L.
Yeah.
His very close friend was Lawrence Picken. And Philip Alliot and Lawrence Picken got me into Peterhouse. In those days, it would have been very difficult for a Turk going through the Turkish schooling system to take the exams in Latin and Greek or whatever it was and get through into Cambridge. So somehow these two managed to get the hurdles lifted. And I came to Peterhouse and had an absolutely a time of true enlightenment. It was just delightful to be in Cambridge for...
What date was this?
This was 1950.
As we passed...
September 1950, Michaelmas term.
As we pass names, sometimes it's a good idea to
Yes,
stop. Since we've interviewed Lawrence Pickin,
yes. Oh, you did?
yes,
I'm happy to hear that.
and so what sort of man was Lawrence? I mean, he was an expert on Turkish music, of course.
Yes.
Um,
Well, he was one of these legendary scholars. Again, a person of the most admirable qualities. He was originally a cell biologist. That's why he was a friend of Philip Alliot, who was also a biologist. Um, and he had gone on then to teach himself Chinese, so he was on the faculty of biology, natural sciences, or whatever it was called at that time. Because of his Chinese connections, he was in the faculty of Oriental languages, and he was also a wonderful musician, so he was also on the faculty of music. And he spoke Turkish as well, so altogether a most wonderful man. He'd always been a bachelor, never married, I believe. Had in his youth these travels through Turkey, and had fallen in love with Turkish culture and traced it all the way into Central Asia, and had intriguing theories about the way Asian music had traveled east and west, and he had some theories which I haven't really looked into, theories of connections between Japanese court music, gagaku, the famous gagaku music, and the music of Anatolia, Central Asia and Anatolia. So very intriguing. Anyway, he had taken a great liking to me, and when I came to Cambridge, he was one of the people who welcomed me here, and said to me that if I had any problems that I should go and see him and so on. But I never did have any problems, so it was all was well.
What did you come to read?
I came, I was, because of my interests in politics and freedom and society and these changes in Turkey, I really wanted to understand how it was that societies worked and what it was that led an ancient society like the Ottoman Empire and Turkey to have a cultural revolution that was so profound and so thoroughgoing, a revolution in which a script that had been used for the last 1,000 years had suddenly overnight been switched over to the Latin script and so on. And I wanted to understand that, and I really wanted to therefore study history, social sciences and so on. But my tutors said that I had been accepted for anthropology, archaeology and anthropology, so they said I should go on with that. So we started off.
Was this Graham Clark, or who was the people's tutor?
I think it was Dennis McSmith,
Yes.
The historian.
Yeah.
And he thought it probably was safer. He was a historian, and he thought that it was safer to have this exotic type go on with a subject that was a little less demanding, shall we say, at that time. History was supposed to be the most difficult to get into, the history tripos. And so I started with archaeology and anthropology, and I liked it, but I was always interested to try and find my way into political thought, historical thought, and so on. Dennis McSmith said to me, well, you do this for part one, and then we'll see, we'll decide what to do for part two. At the end of part one, I got a first. That was a great surprise to the college. They didn't expect that. And once I got a first, then I got a scholarship and so on. They said, oh, you can't change now. So we went on after that.
Who were your teachers in that, both either the first year or second year undergraduate level in Cambridge? Did any have a striking impression on you?
Well, Jack Goody, of course. And
he was teaching you?
he was a graduate student,
I see.
and so was Kathleen Goff,
Mm.
and so was Ray Smith.
Yes.
They were all graduate students, and I was an undergraduate. And as I think I was telling you earlier, the first day I came to Cambridge, my first few days outside Turkey, at the age of 19, 20, I decided to go down to London to see what the big city was like. So I went to the train station, and I was walking along the platform, deciding which compartment to go into, and I saw a very attractive woman sitting in one of the compartments. So I promptly went in and sat opposite her. This lady turned out to be Kathleen Goff, and we started up a conversation. She saw the book I was reading, which was the newer. And she started up the conversation, and then she became my supervisor. So she was my first supervisor in Cambridge. Meyer Fortis hemmed and hawed first as to whether a graduate student should be my supervisor. He was perhaps thinking that might be Gwilym Jones or Rio Fortune or someone like that might be more appropriate. But Kathleen was wonderful. And then,
what sort of person was she? Just, I mean, she influenced you later also in relation to your work on kinship in
yes,
India.
yes.
But as a person, everyone says she's very beautiful, but was she a very
She
nice
was
person as well?
extremely nice, very full of enthusiasms. At that time, I think she had just divorced her husband, with whom she had been in India. She was always full of stories of great amusement as far as these curious customs of the Nayar and the Brahmin, the Nambudiri Brahmin in South India were concerned. She was very open-minded, but she was also very intrigued by all that had gone on. She came from a family in the north, and found herself in Cambridge in a society in which she didn't feel entirely comfortable. And so the psychological element was quite uppermost in her mind. And I think it was that tension between her background from the north, a modest family, I think, in the north, and her situation in an intellectually exciting and important place like Cambridge. That tension, I think, led her further into subjects of psychological analysis. And so her take on India, South India, the Nayar Nambudiri matter, took her further and further in the direction of psychoanalytic theories. And I was at the time myself very interested in psychoanalysis, so that was another bond between us, because at that time I thought that some of the problems in Turkey could be understood by a combination of psychology, psychological theorizing, and sociological theorizing. I've come to believe that politics doesn't lend itself very easily to psychological analysis, in fact, that the sociological parts, anthropological parts are much more important. But at that time, in any case, this was a nice bond between us, and we explored all sorts of theories and ideas. And it was a matter of immense enthusiasm on the part of Kathleen Goff, Jack Goody.
What was the young Jack Goody like? He's another person we've interviewed as a teacher. I mean, you know, he's got a fantastic range and width of mind.
Yes, yes.
But in spoken language, he sometimes hesitates between various options.
Yes, but he was such a warm and gentle and decent and open human being, and that came through loud and clear. in all his relations. There was a way in which he could bring out the best in people. And I think that has been true for Jack Goody all his life. He has been able to generate the best out of people, and that was an aspect of his character which I found extremely attractive and very charming. And so I was very, very fortunate. I mean, you know, it's the kind of intellectual direction that one would want anyone to have. It was simply delightful. Maya Fortis had just come, and he also was full of enthusiasm. He was having difficulties with Ethel Lindgren,
yes,
and with Rio Fortune.
Yes.
Rio Fortune was going through one of his really difficult periods in which he had great difficulty communicating with people. And so he was in and out of the department, and I think Maya didn't know quite what to make of him and how to handle him. I have later come to realize what a remarkable history he had behind him with his travels from New Zealand with Margaret Mead, Gregory Bateson, and so on. But at that time, of course, I was totally unaware of all of that. And Ethel Lindgren was working especially with another wonderful graduate student at the time, Raith Bulmer.
Oh, yes.
Dear Raith Bulmer, a man of, again, immense charm and enthusiasm and interest, of very wide interests. He was interested in the biological aspects of social cohesion. He had been much influenced by the work of Tinbergen, and he was always telling us stories about penguins and fishes and other creatures who have family lives and so on. And he was very intrigued by the way some of these ideas could be carried over to his work among Lapps in northern Sweden and Norway. So Maya.
Was Maya? We got a film of him lecturing on divination.
Yes.
No interview with him.
Yes.
I knew him late in his life as a very, very delightful, kind,
yes,
charming man.
Yes.
Was that your impression of him?
That was my impression too. When I told him of my interests in, with Kathleen Goff about psychology and the influence of Freud on social matters, he discouraged me. He said, no, even though he himself was a psychologist, he said, no, don't go in that direction. That first you must understand Durkheim and Weber. First, the social elements come first. He was not a very good lecturer. He was a very hesitant lecturer. But he was a very warm human being, and so in seminars he was really very good. We would have these wonderful seminars at which the graduate students and the undergraduates would get together, and there were perhaps 20, 30 of us around a large table in the department. I think it was every Wednesday afternoon. And we would work on a particular topic. I do remember that the first or second year we worked for a long time on kinship systems of Australia, which was a real eye-opener. And it was wonderful to have the exchanges between the more experienced graduate students and Maya, and the contributions of very interested undergraduates to these topics. So these were periods of immense intellectual vivacity.
And then you go off to the bun shop, is that?
Yes. After the seminars, we'd go to the bun shop and have mild and bitters and so on, and get on with discussions. Evans Pritchard, I used to run the anthropology club, and one of the highlights was the visit of Evans Pritchard, who also was a very gentle person, at least towards the undergraduates, he was gentle. I'm not sure that he was all that very gentle with his colleagues. But what I do remember about Evans Pritchard was the totally off-handed way he treated the occasion to which he had been invited, in the sense that he came and gave a lecture in which he literally started in the middle of a sentence that he had been writing and went on reading what he had been writing for about 45 minutes and then ended in the middle of a paragraph, just like that, and left the rest of us wondering as to what this had been all about, because there was very little explanation as to what he was up to. I think at that time he was working on those lectures that he gave on the BBC, the Reith lectures, I believe. But I do remember that we couldn't make head or tail of it. At a later occasion, we had a visit by Lévi-Strauss, Claude Lévi-Strauss, and some of us had been reading Lévi-Strauss. We had another one of the graduate students was Derek Stenning, who worked among the Fulani. And he made a presentation of Lévi-Strauss's Les formes élémentaires de la vie religieuse. Les formes de la parenté, les formes élémentaires de la parenté. I think that's the title. And Maya poo-pooed it, said that it was totally irrelevant and not very significant, unimportant work. It has not turned out to be so, actually. But I do remember that was the first sort of take on this very seminal work in our group, which has always reminded me of how easy it is to mistake really significant works to be less than what they are. Later, I think it was my first year as a graduate student.
So you, just to finish, you got a 2-1 or?
For part 2,
yes.
There were 4 of us who were sort of at the head of the group, and I got a 2-1 in the part 2 of the Tripos. I think Jean Lafontaine got a first.
I was going to just ask about Jean, because she's another person we've talked to about this.
Yes.
Or Jack interviewed. What was the young Jean Lafontaine like? She was from a colonial background, wasn't she?
Yes, she was from East Africa, but her family had very strong connections with Istanbul, with Turkey. And so Jean and I were very close friends, and I was extremely fond of her. We used to go to May balls and things together. And would work together, and were sort of challenging each other in the work we were doing in anthropology. There was another woman, Anne, I can't remember her family name now, who also got a first. She was from Hungary, and was very facile in the way she wrote. She wrote rather well. And Maya was very impressed by her. So those 2, I think, the 2 ladies got the firsts at that time. And myself and Anthony Forge.
Oh, yes.
And
Ray Smith, or you said he was a graduate student?
Ray was already a graduate student. Southwold.
Oh, Martin Southwold.
Martin Southwold. We were the ones who were challenging these ladies. Then in my first year as a graduate student, Maya, I think it was that time, Maya wanted to make a change in the department, so somehow he induced Ethel Lindgren to leave, and her position was then filled by Edmund Leach.
And this was about 1953. was it?
53, 54, I think, 54. Yes. Edmund came and gave a lecture, and we analyzed. Oh, he also took part in a seminar, and I remember analyzing and criticizing the political systems of Highland Burma rather severely. He got very angry and stormed out of the room. He had a very strong spirit. But,
you had analysed it severely, or the
yes.
group had, yes.
Well, I had too. I was the one responsible. But then we became very good friends. And he had been a reader in London, and he took a lectureship here to come to Cambridge. And he and I were both very interested in Lévi-Strauss and the work that was being done in France. And so over time we became closer and closer friends. And we were both extremely interested in the whole question of the structure of consciousness and the structure, the organization of symbolism and consciousness. And we thought that this was one way in which this whole matter of social structures could be traced into the problem of the structure of consciousness in the mind, and the relationship between symbolic forms and structures of consciousness could be related. And we thought that this was one way in which the whole question of ritual symbolism in religion and so on could be investigated and analyzed. And that was very exciting and challenging. So in many seminars, I remember, we pursued some of these issues. He had, Edmund Leach was a very striking person, a man of extraordinary intelligence and perceptiveness. And he had a sense of the need to establish contrasts, difference. He was very concerned to take the opposite point of view from whatever was being promoted. And in that clash, one usually went a sort of thesis, antithesis, synthesis sort of dialectic in new directions. And so he was extremely challenging in that way. But I think that attitude of questioning issues all the time in every seminar got on Maya Fortis's nerves. And so as time went on, regrettably, the relations between them became more and more distant. They were always cordial, but they became less and less nice towards each other in private.
From what date was that? While you were still a graduate student?
Yes, yes. It started rather early, but it went on and became rather a bitter matter, actually, in their relations, especially once Edmund Leach was promoted to become a professor and then Provost of Kings, and Maya Fortis was a Fellow of Kings. The relationship became quite distant, regrettably.
I mean, it was obviously a personality clash, but also theoretical clash between...
As well.
Yes,
yes,
structural functionalism and structuralism.
Yes, yes,
and also
yes.
an area clash between
Africa and Asia.
Yes,
yes. All of those were involved. All of those were involved. But most importantly, I think it was also a clash between a South African Jew who felt somewhat alienated in the society in Cambridge towards someone who was seen as a member of the upper classes in Britain. So that was there was that element in
which is what Edmund drew attention to in
yes,
his
yes,
piece on Maya.
yes.
What was the relation between Jack Goody and, obviously you got on very well with Maya, but with Edmund?
Very well. Edmund liked Jack very much because of, and Jack, because of that, that unusual quality that he has, whereby he can bring out the best in people. He brought out the best in Edmund Leach as well. And so there was always a very good relationship there. Jack was always very fair. Things had to be managed in these seminars because Maya Fortis and Edmund Leach would go at each other, hammer and tongs. And Jack was very adept at managing and controlling the level of tension and making very fair comments, which really was very helpful, very important.
Had Stanley Tambaya joined the department by that time?
No. Stanley came much later. I met him when I was working in Sri Lanka. I thought originally that I would go to Central Asia, where I thought, since I knew Turkish, it would be easier to learn the languages and work there. Then the more I looked into the matter, these were of course the days of the Cold War, it looked very difficult to get into Central Asia. The parts where Turkish was spoken where we might have found some groups in northern Ladakh. There have been some, I think, Kyrgyz or Uyghur groups who had come over as a result of the revolution in China. But they were small, meager groups, and it looked increasingly unlikely that useful fieldwork could be done there. So Edmund had at that time made arrangements for himself to go to Sri Lanka. He said to me, to Ceylon at the time, he said to me that, you know, would I like to go to Ceylon and assist in the work to be done there myself. So I thought this was wonderful. I didn't know much about Buddhism, but I was interested in working in a society that was complex and sophisticated and challenging. And so it was the best decision in my life to go there. It was quite a heady affair. Anyway, to go back to Stanley Tambaya, when he was a lecturer. He'd just come back. He, I think, graduated from a school from Syracuse University in the United States, and was a lecturer at the University of Ceylon in Peradeniya. And we met, and we hit it off, and I introduced him to Edmund.
Out there or here?
There, in Ceylon. And then when a position opened up, by that time I was already in America, and when a position opened up here, Edmund invited Tambaya to apply for it and come to Cambridge.
That was in the early 60s, I suppose.
Yes, early 60s, yes, that's right. Yes.
What was Stanley Tambaya like? We've also interviewed him.
Yes. Well, he had worked in Thailand, and he came from a Christian Tamil family in Ceylon. He was very well entrenched in Ceylon, had very good friends, but the Tamil Sinhalese situation there increasingly got more and more difficult. But he was obviously a man of great intellectual vigor, and I think Cambridge suited him extremely well, and he was very happy in Cambridge. I'm not so sure that he's been so happy in the States as in Cambridge, England.
He went to Harvard, did he?
He went, well, the way it worked was this. He was in Cambridge, and I came to Cambridge to spend a year at Clare Hall as I was teaching at the University of Chicago. And since we had my interests in Ceylon were very profound, and I maintained all my friendships, Tambaya and I, of course, were together frequently. So when I returned to Chicago, I started a movement in Chicago to try and get Tambaya to come to Chicago. He had just married an American girl, Mary Wynn, yes, Mary Wynn. So he's very dark, one of the darker Tamils. You know, the Tamils can be very, very dark, and he's one of the darker Tamils. And this girl he had married was very, very blonde, very, very white, so the contrast between them was very striking. In any case, she was an American, came from a distinguished family in America, and I thought that they would be happy in America, that they would like it there in Chicago. So I got the department in Chicago to be interested in Tambi, and they invited him and liked him. But at that time, Harvard was trying to get me to go to Harvard. So as it happened, we couldn't get together in Chicago. I went to Harvard, Tambaya came to Chicago. And once I was in Harvard, I tried to get him to Harvard. So that's how that worked, actually. And we have been friends ever since. He had a very good effect in Chicago. People liked him very much. He brought his sophistication from Cambridge with the background of the theories of social anthropology here, and his knowledge of Thailand and Sri Lanka and India and so on to bear. And so that was all very welcome. Chicago was a very important center for the study of Indian matters, South Asian matters. The South Asian Committee was a lively committee. So he was very popular there. How is our time going? Oh, we have time.
Yes,
we have time.
Returning to your PhD, you were supervised by Edmund Leach for your PhD, or later on maybe?
I was first working with Maya Fortis, but then once I started working in Ceylon, and Edmund had spent some time there, and Edmund and I started working together on all these very complex subjects of ritual and religion and symbolism and the ups and downs of Sinhalese Tamil relations and so on. So naturally I drifted further and further in the direction of Edmund. And also, Edmund, we had, as I said earlier, we shared this interest in the then French approaches to theorizing, and so it was Edmund who was most responsible for the PhD work. I was in Sri Lanka, and we kept a voluminous correspondence, which I keep, which I will pass on to you sometime, yes. And it is very amusing, because it's an amusing correspondence in the sense that it shows how clueless we really were, both of us, because Edmund didn't speak really much Sinhalese. By that time I was pretty fluent, but I really didn't know too much about the complexities of the extraordinary complexities of Sinhalese mythology and Sinhalese ritual. And I was sort of groping in the dark, trying to figure out how this worked. And it was all still extremely fresh and new. And it was, going back on our correspondence, it is really striking of how naive we really were in thinking that we'd be able to come to easy solutions.
Well, what would be interesting, you've got his letters to you.
Yes.
And your letters to him will be in the King's College Library.
Yes.
In the archive, and
yes.
put the two together.
Yes. Yes. He used to. He was a wonderful correspondent. I'm afraid I never was such a good correspondent with my graduate students. He was extremely generous. He would write pages and pages and pages on comments on what had been